Welcome to this journey through one of the most heartbreaking and deliberately suppressed chapters in Irish history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, not through sensational horror, but through the suffocating weight of systematic abandonment and the choices desperate people made when all other choices had been stripped away. We're about to delve into a mystery that remained buried beneath official records and collective shame for over 170 years, where thousands of children vanished into workhouses, industrial schools, and unmarked graves, leaving a legacy so devastating that Ireland itself chose to forget their names, their faces, their very existence. It was the year 1847. Across Europe, revolutions were stirring. In America, the Mexican-American War was drawing to a close. But in Ireland, a different kind of war was being waged, a silent, invisible war against the poorest citizens of what was then part of the British Empire. A war fought not with bullets, but with bureaucracy, indifference, and a political philosophy that viewed starvation as God's mechanism for population control. They called it Black 47, the darkest year of the Great Famine. But this isn't the famine story you learned in school. This is the story that exists in the margins of those history books, in the gaps between recorded deaths, in the silent spaces where children's voices once echoed before fading into bureaucratic obscurity. This is the story of what happened to the children they left behind. Ireland in 1008, 147, was a country transformed into a mass grave. Picture the landscape. Emerald hillsides that had once represented prosperity now stretched in blighted monotony, the potato fields blackened by Phytophthora infestans asterisk, the fungal pathogen that had arrived on merchant ships from America in 1008, 145. The air itself seemed different in those years. Survivors would later describe it as carrying a peculiar sweetness. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with something else, something human, something that settled in your throat and wouldn't leave. The Irish countryside had always been a patchwork of small tenant farms, families living in one-room cottages with earthen floors, surviving almost entirely on the potato. It wasn't a choice born of preference, but of mathematics. An acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. An acre of wheat could feed perhaps 2. When you were paying rent to an absentee English landlord who demanded every other crop be sold for profit, you survived on potatoes, or you didn't survive at all. Before the blight, Ireland had a population of approximately 5 million people, the majority of them living in conditions that would have shocked even the poorest English laborers. But they survived. They married young, had large families, lived in their small cottages with their pigs and chickens, and if life was hard, it was at least life. Then the potatoes turned black, first in isolated patches in September 1008, 145, then everywhere, the stalks withered. The tubers rotted in the ground, dissolving into a putrid slime that stained the earth. Families who had stored potatoes for the winter watched helplessly as their entire food supply liquefied within weeks, the stench filling their cottages with the smell of death before death itself arrived. The British government's response to the famine has been extensively documented. The inadequate relief efforts, the continued exportation of food from Ireland even as people starved, the public works programs that paid starvation wages for backbreaking labor. But there was another response, quieter and more insidious, that has received far less attention. The workhouse system. Workhouses had existed in Ireland since the Poor Law Extension Act of 1008, 147, modeled on the English system. They were designed on a principle that sounds almost satirical in its cruelty. Relief should be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. The conditions had to be worse than the worst conditions outside to discourage dependency. By 1847 there were 130 workhouses across Ireland. They were massive stone structures, deliberately imposing and prison-like in their architecture. High walls, separated yards for different classes of inmates, men separated from women, children separated from parents. The philosophy was that poverty was a moral failure, and the workhouse was meant to be a place of reformation, not comfort. But in 1847, these workhouses became something else entirely. They became the last resort for people who had exhausted every other option. And they became, for thousands of children, the final destination on a journey from which there would be no return. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name, for our purposes, is Maeve O'Connor. She was 7 years old in the spring of 1847. She had 2 younger brothers, ages 5 and 3. Their father had died the previous winter, officially of famine fever. Either typhus or relapsing fever, diseases that spread explosively in populations weakened by starvation, but really of starvation with a medical name attached to make it seem more natural, more inevitable. Maeve's mother, Catherine, had held on through the winter. She'd boiled nettles and dandelions. She'd scraped lichen from rocks. She'd begged at the houses of farmers who still had food. Her children hidden in the cottage because the sight of starving children made people close their doors faster. By March, Catherine weighed perhaps 70 pounds. Her body had consumed itself, first the fat, then the muscle, then finally beginning to break down her organs. She had the swollen belly and stick, thin limbs that characterize severe malnutrition. Her gums bled constantly. Her hair fell out in clumps, but she was still alive, and so were her children. The cottage was gone. The landlord had tumbled it, the euphemism for eviction that involved literally tearing down a family's home to prevent them from returning. They'd been living in a scalp, a crude shelter made of branches and sod, barely more than a hole in the ground with some covering. Catherine knew she was dying, but more than that, she knew she was going to die soon, within days, maybe a week at most. And then what would happen to her children? This is the question that haunted thousands of Irish mothers in 1847. Die and leave your children to starve beside your body, or make a different choice, one that would haunt Ireland for generations. The nearest workhouse was in Skibbereen, County Cork. Skibbereen had become synonymous with famine horror. It was one of the worst affected areas, where the death rate was so high that bodies lay unburied in the streets. A Quaker relief worker named William Forster visited in February 1847 and wrote descriptions that shocked England. In the first cabin, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw. I approached with horror, and found by a low moaning they were alive. But Skibbereen also had a workhouse, and workhouses took children. According to surviving records, Catherine O'Connor arrived at Skibbereen Workhouse in late March 1847. She had walked approximately 12 miles, carrying her 3-year-old son the entire way, Maeve and the 5-year-old walked beside her. The workhouse was overwhelmed. It had been built to house 800 people. In March 1847, it held over 3,000. People were lying in corridors. The yards were filled with temporary sheds. Disease spread like wildfire: typhus, dysentery, cholera. The mortality rate was staggering, but they were taking children. Here's what Catherine did, according to the admission records. She surrendered her children to the workhouse and then left. She told the admission clerk that she was going to stay with relatives in another county. This was almost certainly a lie. What Catherine was actually doing was giving her children a chance at survival, however slim, while removing her own mouth from the equation. One fewer person consuming the workhouse's limited resources meant slightly more food for her children. Catherine O'Connor died on the road 2 days later. Her body was found in a ditch by a farmer and buried in an unmarked grave with 7 other bodies in the corner of a field. No name, no record, just another casualty of Black 47. But her children were in the workhouse. They had been processed, deloused, separated by gender Maeve to the girls' ward, her brothers to the boys' ward. They would never see their mother again. They would never know how or when or where she died. They would be 3 more entries in a ledger that would eventually hold the names of thousands. This was the pattern repeating across Ireland, dying parents making impossible choices. Children surrendered not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, heartbreaking love. A final attempt to give them some chance, any chance, at survival. But what actually happened to these children inside the workhouse walls? That's where our story truly begins. And that's where the deliberate forgetting starts. The building's architecture told you everything you needed to know about its philosophy. High walls of gray stone, imposing and prison-like. Small, barred windows set high in the walls. A front entrance designed to intimidate. The message was clear. This is not a place of comfort. This is a place of last resort. Inside, the reality was worse than the architecture suggested. The children's wards were long rooms with rows of narrow beds, or, more accurately in 1,847, rows of straw mattresses on the floor, because there weren't enough beds for the influx. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, illness, the particular sour smell of children's fear and sickness. Ventilation was poor, light was dim. Maeve O'Connor would have been stripped of her ragged clothing upon arrival, bathed in cold water, deloused, and given a workhouse uniform, a rough dress of coarse fabric. Her hair would have been cut short or shaved entirely, a practical measure against lice that also served to strip away individuality and identity. She would have been assigned a number. The workhouse kept meticulous records, admission dates, names, ages, family relationships. But inside the workhouse, you were increasingly defined by your number, not your name. The daily routine was rigid. Wake at 6, prayers. Breakfast usually stir, about a thin porridge made from Indian cornmeal, imported as famine relief, and universally hated for its poor nutritional value and tendency to cause digestive problems. Work assignments for older children picking oakum, breaking stones, or learning industrial skills, like sewing and cobbling. More prayers, dinner, perhaps some bread, sometimes weak soup, evening prayers, bed. Silence was enforced. Children were not permitted to speak during meals or work. Punishment for infractions was swift confinement in dark cells, reduction of already meager rations, or physical beatings. But the routine was almost a mercy compared to the reality that emerged in the spring of 1,847. The children were still dying. By April 1,847, the Skibbereen workhouse was experiencing what officials clinically termed an outbreak of famine fever. This was actually multiple diseases: typhus, spread by lice, relapsing fever, spread by lice, dysentery from contaminated water and overcrowding, cholera from inadequate sanitation. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their immune systems, already compromised by malnutrition, couldn't fight off infections. The overcrowding meant diseases spread explosively. A child could wake up healthy, or relatively healthy, and be dead by nightfall. The workhouse had fever sheds, separate buildings where the sick were isolated. In theory, this was meant to prevent contagion. In practice, the fever sheds in 1008, 147 were death houses. Once a child was moved there, the odds of coming out alive were minimal. Records from Skibbereen show that between January and December 1008, 147, approximately 2,000 people died in the workhouse. Of these, roughly 60% were children under the age of 15. Let me put that in perspective. That's 100 children dead in a single workhouse in a single year, and Skibbereen, while among the worst affected, was not unique. This pattern repeated across Ireland. Cork Union Workhouse, 700 deaths in 1008, 147 majority children. Bantry Workhouse, 900 deaths, majority children. Castlebar Workhouse, 200 deaths. The numbers are staggering. But what they don't convey is the human reality of what was happening inside those walls. Maeve O'Connor survived the first month. This alone made her fortunate. Many children died within days of admission, their bodies too weakened to endure even the marginal improvement in food availability. But her 5-year-old brother developed typhus in mid-April. According to workhouse records, he was moved to the fever shed on April 18, 1008, 147. He died on April 22. His body was buried in the workhouse cemetery, an ever-expanding field behind the main building where bodies were interred in mass graves, sometimes 30 or 40 to a pit, with minimal ceremony and often no individual markers. Maeve would not have been told immediately about her brother's death. The workhouse philosophy discouraged emotional attachment. She would have simply noticed his absence, eventually learned the truth from whispers among other children. Her 3-year-old brother survived longer. He made it through April, through May, but in June he developed dysentery. The symptoms were brutal: severe diarrhea, abdominal cramping, fever, weakness. In a severely malnourished child, dysentery was usually fatal. He died on June 11, 1008, 147, another body for the mass grave, another entry in the ledger, another child whose life ended in a crowded workhouse ward, without family, without comfort, without even the dignity of an individual burial. Maeve was now alone, 7 years old, orphaned, living in an institution where children died every single day. But she survived through the summer of 1008, 147, through the autumn, through the winter, when the mortality rate actually decreased, not because conditions improved, but because so many of the weakest had already died. By the spring of 1008, 148, Maeve O'Connor had spent a full year in the Skibbereen workhouse. She had grown thinner, quieter. The workhouse had done what workhouses do. It had broken something essential in her spirit, replaced it with obedience and silence and a kind of numb endurance. But she was alive, and being alive in a famine workhouse meant you could be useful. That's when the ships started coming. In 1008, 148, the British government and various Irish poor law guardians developed a solution to what they termed the orphan problem. There were thousands of children in workhouses, orphaned, abandoned, or surrendered by parents who couldn't care for them. They were consuming resources. They were a financial burden on the poor law system. But the British colonies needed workers. Canada, particularly, needed labor. The Canadian agricultural economy was expanding. They needed farmhands, domestic servants, laborers. And Irish orphans, properly managed, could fill that need. The scheme was presented as humanitarian. These children were being given opportunities. they could never have in Ireland. They were being sent to good Christian homes, where they would be fed, clothed, educated, and trained in useful skills. It was, the officials insisted, a mercy. Between 1848 and 1850, approximately 40 Irish workhouse children were shipped to Canada under this program. The reality was significantly darker than the official narrative. In March 1848, Maeve O'Connor was informed that she had been selected for emigration to Canada. According to workhouse records, she was now 8 years old, though malnutrition had stunted her growth so severely that she appeared perhaps 5 or 6. She was given no choice in the matter. Children didn't have choices. They had destinies determined by administrators who saw them as entries in ledgers, as problems to be solved, as economic burdens to be transferred elsewhere. On April 3, 1848, Maeve and approximately 150 other children from various Cork workhouses were transported to Cork Harbour. They were marched through the streets, a line of silent, thin children in workhouse uniforms, supervised by poor law officials. Some Cork citizens turned away. Others watched with what might have been pity or might have been relief that these problems were being removed from their sight. At the harbor, the children were loaded onto a ship called the Naomi Asterisk. It was a merchant vessel that had been converted for passenger transport, or, more accurately, had been minimally adapted to carry human cargo in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. The crossing took 6 weeks. The children were housed in the hold, in wooden berths stacked 3 high with perhaps 18 inches of space between levels. Ventilation was poor. Sanitation was minimal buckets that were emptied overboard once daily. Food was sparse. Hard biscuits, occasional salt pork, water that grew increasingly brackish as the journey progressed. Disease spread predictably: typhus, dysentery, what was called ship fever, probably typhus again. Children died during the crossing. Their small bodies were sewn into canvas and dropped overboard with minimal ceremony. The ship's log, which survives in Canadian Maritime Archives, records 11 children dying during the passage. 11 more names for the uncounted dead. Maeve survived the crossing. She arrived in Montreal on May 17, 1008, 148 alive, but suffering from scurvy and severe malnutrition. She was processed through Grosse Isle, the quarantine station, and eventually transported inland to be distributed to Canadian families who had requested laborers. What happened next is where individual stories like Maeve's disappear into the fog of incomplete records and deliberate silence. Here's what we know from surviving documentation. Between 1848 and 1850, approximately 40 Irish workhouse children were sent to Canada. They were distributed primarily to rural farming families across Ontario and Quebec. The official records show their names, ages, workhouse of origin, and ship of transport. What the records don't show, what was never systematically documented, was what happened to them afterward. There was no follow-up system, no inspections, no mechanism for ensuring these children were being treated well, or even being treated humanely. They were distributed like parcels, and then forgotten by the system that had sent them. Some, perhaps many, went to families who genuinely needed labor and treated their young workers with relative decency. They were fed, housed, worked hard but not abusively, and eventually integrated into Canadian life as adults. But others were not so fortunate. The children were bound by indenture contracts, legal documents that essentially made them unpaid servants until age 18 for girls, 20, one for boys. They had no legal rights, they couldn't leave, they couldn't complain to authorities. If they ran away and were caught, they could be returned to their masters and punished. This created a system ripe for abuse. Some children were worked brutally 60-hour days in all weather, fed minimally, housed in barns or unheated sheds. Some were beaten regularly. Some, and this is documented in scattered letters and later testimony, were sexually abused. But perhaps most devastating was the cultural erasure. These children were Irish, Catholic. They spoke with Irish accents, carried Irish names, had Irish memories. Many of the families who took them were Protestant English, speaking Canadians who viewed Irish Catholics with suspicion or contempt. The children were often renamed. Their Catholicism was suppressed or forbidden. They were punished for speaking Gaelic. Their Irish identity was systematically stripped away, replaced with a Canadian identity that denied their origins. They became, in essence, ghost children, neither fully Irish nor fully Canadian, separated from their homeland, their families, their culture, living in a strange land where they were valued only for their labor. Researchers attempting to trace these children's fates encounter a frustrating pattern. The paper trail simply stops. A child like Maeve O'Connor, we can follow her from the Skibbereen Workhouse admission records through the emigration lists to the ship's manifest to the Gross Isle processing records. We know she was sent to a farmer named James McIntyre in Ontario, and then nothing, no marriage record, no death record, no census entry under that name. It's as if she ceased to exist. This pattern repeats thousands of times. Children who appear in Irish workhouse records, appear in ship manifests, appear in Canadian distribution lists, and then vanish from the historical record entirely. Some explanations are innocent. Name changes, moves to other regions, early deaths that went unrecorded in rural areas. But the scale of the silence suggests something more systematic. It suggests that these children were seen as dispensable, forgettable, not important enough to track or document or remember. In recent decades, researchers have discovered something chilling: unmarked graves scattered across rural Ontario and Quebec, containing the remains of children who died in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Some are in the corners of farmers' fields. Some are in abandoned sections of rural cemeteries. Some are on the edges of properties, away from family plots. The children are often buried without coffins, without markers, without any indication of who they were. Forensic analysis shows signs of malnutrition, disease, and in some cases, signs of violence, broken bones, skull fractures. How many of these nameless graves contain Irish workhouse children who died far from home, unmourned and unremembered? We don't know, we can't know, the records don't exist. The institutional forgetting both Ireland and Canada had reasons to forget this story. For Ireland, the famine years represented shame and trauma. The workhouses, those grim institutions where children died by the thousands, were reminders of suffering that people wanted to leave behind. As Ireland rebuilt in the late 19th century, the famine became something acknowledged but not deeply examined. The workhouse children, particularly those shipped away, became footnotes in a larger tragedy. For Canada, the story was complicated differently. The country was building a national identity. The idea that this identity was built partly on the exploitation of traumatized Irish orphans' children, who were essentially unpaid labor with no legal protections, didn't fit the narrative of Canada. As a benevolent refuge, so both countries, in their different ways, chose silence. The workhouse records gathered dust in archives. The emigration lists were filed away. The indenture contracts were lost or destroyed. The children themselves, as they aged into adulthood, often kept their stories private, either from shame, trauma, or simple survival instinct in communities where Irish Catholics faced discrimination. The silence became complete. Hash hash, hash the voices that survived, but not entirely. A few voices survived. Letters written decades later, oral histories collected in the 20th century, memoirs written in old age by people who finally felt safe enough to tell their stories. One such account comes from a woman named Bridget Flynn, who was sent from Killarney Workhouse to Canada in 1849 at age 9. She wrote a letter in 1920 at age 80 to a local historian. Excerpts survive. I remember being hungry always. In the workhouse we were hungry. On the ship we were hungry. In Canada I was hungry for 3 more years until my body stopped expecting food. Learned to survive on what little came. I remember my mother's face, but not her voice. I remember my brother's name Thomas, but not where he died. I remember being told I was going to a place of opportunity. What I found was work without end and a loneliness that has never left me. Another account from a man named Michael Brennan, recorded in a 1935 oral history. They took me from Limerick Workhouse when I was 7. My mother had left me there when I was 6. I never saw her again, never knew if she lived or died. In Canada they put me with a farmer who worked me like a horse and beat me worse than a horse. When I was 12 I ran away, lived in the woods for a month, before another farmer found me and took me in. He was kinder, but I never felt Canadian, and I could never go home to Ireland. I was nowhere and no one. These fragments, rare, precious, heartbreaking, are almost all we have. Thousands of children, and only a handful of voices, survived to tell their stories. For over 150 years, this story remained buried. It wasn't taught in Irish schools. It wasn't part of Canadian history. The workhouse children who were shipped to Canada were a footnote to a footnote briefly mentioned in academic histories of the famine, but never deeply examined. That changed in the 1990s. Researchers began systematically examining workhouse records. Genealogists working with Irish, Canadian families started uncovering patterns. The scale of the orphan emigration scheme became clear. The 4-0 children, the lack of follow-up, the vanishing into silence. In 1997, an organization called the Irish Workhouse Centre was established in County Galway. They began digitizing workhouse records, making them publicly accessible. Suddenly, people could trace their ancestors through the workhouse system. What they found was devastating. Families discovering that great-grandparents had been workhouse children. Canadians discovering Irish workhouse origins they'd never known about. Genealogists finding children's names in immigration lists, and then finding nothing else, no marriage records, no death records, no evidence of adult lives. The silence began to break. Hash hash, hash the graves they're still finding in 2012. Construction workers in rural Ontario uncovered human remains on a property being developed for housing. Forensic anthropologists were called in. What they found was a grave containing the remains of 3 children, aged approximately 8-12 years old, buried without coffins, dating to approximately 1,850. Further investigation revealed that the property had been a farm in the 1,840s-50s. The farmer had taken in workhouse children from Ireland. There were records of 2 children being placed there. So who were the 3 in the grave? Were these the documented children plus 1 undocumented? Or were these different children entirely, not even recorded in the placement lists? The remains were analyzed. Signs of malnutrition, signs of hard physical labor inappropriate for their ages, bone stress in shoulders and backs from carrying heavy loads. One showed signs of a poorly healed broken arm. They died far from home. They were buried without ceremony. They were forgotten, until construction workers' shovels turned up their bones 162 years later. This discovery led to a broader search. How many other such graves existed? The answer appears to be many. A 2015 survey of rural properties in Ontario, where Irish workhouse children had been placed, found evidence of unmarked graves on approximately 15% of surveyed sites. Extrapolating from placement records, this could mean hundreds of unmarked graves containing Irish workhouse children. Most will never be found. The farms have been subdivided, developed, or abandoned. The people who knew where children were buried are long dead. The children remain nameless in the earth. The institutional response in 2016. An Irish government commission examining historical institutional abuse included a section on the workhouse emigration scheme. Their findings were damning. The transportation of workhouse children to Canada was undertaken without adequate safeguards for the children's welfare. No system of inspection was established. No follow-up was conducted. Children were effectively abandoned to whatever fate awaited them, with no recourse to protection or support. This represents a failure of duty of care of the most profound kind, but there was no apology, no memorial, no systematic effort to identify and honor the children who died. The Canadian government has remained largely silent on the issue. There are occasional academic conferences. Some local historical societies have erected small markers, but there has been no national recognition of what happened to these children. The silence, in many ways, continues. Today, millions of Canadians and Americans have Irish famine ancestry. Many are descended from workhouse children who were shipped overseas. Most don't know this part of their family history. The trauma was buried so deep, passed through generations as silence rather than story, that the origin point was lost. But the trauma itself, that often survived, even when the story didn't. Psychologists studying intergenerational trauma have found patterns in families with famine ancestry. Attachment issues, fear of hunger, difficulty with emotional expression, patterns of silence around family history. The trauma echoes down through generations, even when the cause is forgotten. The workhouse children who survived carried something with them, a knowledge of abandonment, a deep understanding that survival meant silence, meant not complaining, meant being useful and invisible. They passed this to their children, who passed it to their children, who passed it to their children. In this way, Ireland's shame became Canada's ghost. The children who were supposed to disappear instead became woven into the fabric of a nation, their silence and trauma part of the foundation. The story of the Irish workhouse children is not unique. Throughout history, populations under stress have made impossible choices about their children. What makes this story particularly haunting is not its uniqueness, but its deliberateness, the systematic nature of the abandonment, the bureaucratic processing of trauma, the institutional forgetting that followed, but questions remain, and they haunt in their specificity. How many children died in workhouses during the famine years? The estimates range from 40, 0 to 60, 0, but the true number is unknowable. Records were incomplete. Deaths were often recorded in groups. Children who died hours after admission were sometimes not recorded at all. How many children were shipped overseas who aren't in the official records? The 40 number represents documented emigrations. But there's evidence of unofficial placements, of children being taken by individuals rather than through official channels, of paperwork that was never filed or has been lost. The true number could be substantially higher. What happened to the children who simply vanished from the records? The ones whose trail stops no death record, no marriage record, no census entry. Did they die young and go unrecorded? Did they change their names and start over? Did they end up in institutions, prisons, or early graves that weren't connected back to their Irish origins? We don't know. We can't know. The silence is too complete. To this day, in rural Ontario and Quebec, when farmers plow their fields and uncover small bones, when property developers find unmarked graves, when genealogists hit dead ends in the 1008, 150s, people wonder, could these be the Irish workhouse children, the forgotten ones, the ones who were supposed to disappear? In Ireland, the workhouses themselves have largely been demolished or repurposed. The mass graves behind them are often unmarked or have been built over. Skibbereen Workhouse, where Maeve O'Connor spent a year of her life, is now partially preserved as a heritage site. Behind it, in an overgrown field, there's a small marker, Famine Burial Ground, approximately 9,000-10,000 interred here, 1008, 147-1851, 9,000 people. Most of them children, no names, no individual markers, just a number that represents unimaginable suffering, compressed into bureaucratic language. And on silent nights, when the fog rolls in from the Atlantic and settles over those forgotten fields, when the temperature drops and the wind carries that particular dampness that Ireland is known for, people still report feeling something in those places, a presence, a sadness, the ghosts of children who died too far from home, too young, too alone. Not supernatural. Something more human and therefore more haunting. The weight of collective forgetting, the echo of trauma unprocessed and unresolved, the knowledge that this happened and was then systematically erased from memory. The children they left behind never really left. They're still here, in the silence, in the gaps in the records, in the unmarked graves, in the DNA of millions who carry their trauma without knowing its origin. If this journey through one of Ireland's darkest and most deliberately suppressed chapters has moved you, if you find yourself sitting with the weight of 0 children sent away and largely forgotten, if this story has provoked reflections that go beyond mere historical curiosity into something more personal, a recognition of how easily people can be erased, how completely suffering can be bureaucratized, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried not in the earth, but in the deliberate silences of history, in the gaps between official records and human truth. Leave a like if this account resonated with you, if it made you think about the children in your own family history who might have been forgotten, the stories that were too painful to tell and so became silences passed down through generations, and comment sharing your own perspectives. How do we honor the dead when we don't even know their names? How do we break the silences that harm us? Until next time, remember, history is not just the stories we tell, but the stories we refuse to tell. And sometimes the most important work is bringing those silences into the light.